Daniel Kensington thought he had everything: a thriving empire, a beautiful fiancée, and freedom from his past. But at a high-profile gala, his world shattered. His ex-wife, Evelyn, appeared after years of silence, holding the hand of a little boy. The child's piercing blue eyes? Identical to Daniel's own. Daniel Kensington had always believed that life was about winning. From the moment he had clawed his way out of his modest beginnings and into the world of wealth and power, he had moved with the singular focus of a man who refused to lose. Business was a battlefield, and he had built an empire by being ruthless, by taking what he wanted, when he wanted it, without looking back. It was a philosophy that had served him well in the boardroom, and for years, it had also been the foundation of his personal life. Until it wasn't. Until the moment he stood in his sleek penthouse, staring at the woman he had once vowed to love, and realized that he felt nothing but exhaustion. Evelyn Kensington, once the woman he had chased with relentless determination, stood across from him, her expression unreadable. She had always been poised, always carried herself with an effortless grace that once fascinated him. But tonight, there was something distant in her eyes, as if she had already begun the process of erasing him from her life. He should have felt something: anger, regret, even relief. But all he felt was the dull inevitability of what was happening between them. "You don't even look at me anymore," Evelyn finally said, her voice calm, detached. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Evelyn, we've been pretending for too long. We both know this isn't working." There was a time when those words would have shattered her, when she would have fought to remind him of everything they had built together, everything she had sacrificed. But that time had passed. Instead, she gave him a slow nod, as if she had expected it. "You're right," she said, and that was what startled him the most: her agreement. He had prepared for resistance, for some last-ditch effort to hold on, but Evelyn wasn't fighting. Daniel should have felt victorious. He was finally free to be with Sienna Monroe, the woman who had reignited something inside of him, something reckless and exhilarating. Sienna was young, vibrant, someone who reminded him of the hunger he had felt when he first built his fortune. With her, he could forget about responsibility, forget about the weight of a marriage that had become more of a business arrangement than a love story. Yet, as Evelyn walked toward the bedroom they had shared for years and calmly closed the door behind her, a strange sensation settled in his chest. It wasn't regret, not exactly. It was something quieter, something that felt uncomfortably like the knowledge that he was making a choice he wouldn't be able to undo. The divorce was finalized with a speed that surprised even him. Evelyn didn't fight him for more than what was necessary, didn't drag him through a scandalous battle in court. She took what was hers, signed the papers, and disappeared. No dramatic goodbyes, no final confrontations. It was almost as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if she had known before he did that their story was already over. The world moved on quickly, as it always did. Within months, Daniel and Sienna were a fixture on the social scene, gracing magazine covers, attending the most exclusive events. Sienna reveled in the attention, in the power that came with being seen on his arm. She was everything Evelyn wasn't: impulsive, fiery, unafraid to demand the spotlight. It was exhilarating at first, intoxicating even, but as time passed, Daniel began to notice the cracks. Sienna wasn't satisfied with just being by his side. She wanted more. More money, more influence, more proof that she had won. The woman who had once made him feel young again now made him feel like a prize she had secured, something to be polished and displayed. She had an insatiable hunger for extravagance, for opulence that even he, a man accustomed to excess, found exhausting. And yet, Daniel pushed those thoughts aside, convincing himself that this was what he had wanted. He had made his choice, and there was no room for second-guessing. Evelyn was in the past, a chapter closed and locked away. Or so he thought. It wasn't until a year later, at a high-profile charity gala, that his carefully constructed new life began to crumble. The evening was one of the most exclusive of the year, a gathering of the city's most powerful figures, a place where reputations were solidified and alliances were made. Daniel was in his element, shaking hands with industry titans, making quiet deals over glasses of aged whiskey. Sienna was at his side, wearing a gown that cost more than most people's yearly salaries, her laughter ringing out as she basked in the attention of those around her. Then the whispers began. It started as a murmur, a ripple through the crowd, shifting glances, hushed tones. Daniel barely noticed at first, too caught up in the performance of his own success. But then he caught sight of the way people were looking, not at him, but at someone else. At her. Evelyn Kensington walked into the ballroom with an ease that was almost unnerving. She wasn't the broken woman he had expected to see, wasn't a shadow of their past. She was radiant, composed, moving through the room with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed anyone's validation. And she wasn't alone. Beside her, gripping her hand with the kind of trust that only belonged to a child, was a boy, no more than 4 or 5 years old, dressed in a small tailored suit that mirrored the kind Daniel himself often wore. And it wasn't just the clothing. It was the eyes. Daniel felt the breath leave his lungs as he met the child's gaze, a gaze so eerily familiar it sent a shock through his entire body. Because it was his. The same sharp blue, the same intensity that stared back at him from the mirror every morning. It was undeniable, irrefutable. Sienna tensed at his side, gripping his arm with a force that bordered on desperation. "Who the hell is that?" she hissed, but Daniel barely heard her. He was already moving. The world around him blurred, the sounds of the gala fading into static. All he could focus on was Evelyn, standing there, watching him with a knowing expression. "You look well, Daniel," she said when he finally reached her, her voice smooth, unreadable. "It's been a while." His mouth went dry. He had no idea what to say, no idea how to form the words that could make sense of what was happening. The boy, oblivious to the storm brewing between the adults, tugged gently at Evelyn's hand. "Mom, can we go now?" "Mom." Daniel felt something in him fracture. "Evelyn," he said, his voice hoarse, his world tilting beneath him. "Tell me." But she only smiled, and in that moment, Daniel Kensington knew whatever answer she was about to give him would change everything. If you were in Evelyn's shoes, would you have told Daniel the truth about Oliver from the start, or would you have kept the secret just like she did? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, if you're enjoying this story, like the video and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Daniel Kensington had always considered himself a man in control. He had built his empire with precision, calculated every move in both business and life with a ruthless efficiency that left no room for surprises. And yet, standing there in the middle of the grand ballroom, surrounded by the city's most elite, he felt a sensation he had not encountered in years: uncertainty. The sight of Evelyn, poised and radiant, and the small boy by her side, a child who could not be mistaken for anything but his own, had shattered the illusion he had so carefully crafted. His world, the world he had chosen, the life he had built with Sienna Monroe, suddenly felt fragile, as if it could collapse with a single word from the woman he had once called his wife. For the first time in years, Daniel struggled to find his voice. He could feel Sienna's sharp nails digging into his arm, her grip tightening as she, too, recognized the unmistakable resemblance between the child and the man she had spent the past few years by. The murmurs around them grew louder, the wealthy socialites in attendance reveling in the unexpected spectacle. Scandal was currency in their circles, and tonight, Daniel Kensington had just become the center of a story that would be whispered about for weeks to come. Evelyn held his gaze, a quiet amusement flickering in her expression. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was something else, something Daniel couldn't quite place, and that infuriated him more than anything. She had been absent from his life for years, erased like a chapter he had chosen to forget, and yet here she was, standing before him with a secret that had the power to dismantle everything he thought he knew. "You have nothing to say?" Evelyn asked finally, her voice smooth, measured. It wasn't taunting, nor was it soft. It was the voice of a woman who had moved on, and somehow, that stung more than he expected. Daniel took a step closer, ignoring the way Sienna hissed his name under her breath, her tone laced with warning. "Who is he?" he asked, though the answer was already clear. The boy, seemingly uninterested in the tension between the adults, glanced up at his mother, his small hand still wrapped around hers. "His name is Oliver," Evelyn said, and Daniel felt his chest tighten. She hadn't given him his last name, hadn't introduced him as a Kensington. The message was clear: this child did not belong to him. "Evelyn," he started, but she shook her head, her expression unreadable. "This isn't the time or the place," she said simply, before turning to the boy. "Come on, sweetheart, let's go." Oliver nodded obediently, casting one last curious glance at Daniel before allowing his mother to lead him away. And just like that, they were gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, waiting for his reaction, waiting for him to do something. He could feel Sienna's rage beside him, her posture tense with barely restrained fury. But he couldn't move, couldn't think past the single realization that kept replaying in his mind. Evelyn had a son, and Daniel had no idea if he had ever been meant to know. The rest of the evening blurred into a meaningless haze. Sienna was relentless, her whispered accusations sharp and insistent, demanding to know if he had been aware, if he had lied to her, if this had all been some elaborate scheme. He barely heard her. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the past, in memories he had long since buried. By the time they returned to their penthouse, Sienna's fury had reached its peak. She paced the living room in her designer gown, her face contorted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I cannot believe this," she seethed. "She just shows up, out of nowhere, with a child that looks exactly like you, and you have nothing to say?" Daniel leaned against the bar, pouring himself a drink with steady hands. He needed to think, needed space to process. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said finally, taking a long sip. Sienna let out a bitter laugh. "How about the truth, Daniel? Did you know about him? Did you leave a pregnant wife for me?" The accusation stung, though he wasn't sure why. "No," he said firmly, setting the glass down with more force than necessary. "I didn't know. If I had, you what?" Sienna interrupted, crossing her arms. "You would have stayed? Please. We both know that's not true. You wanted out of that marriage, and you got what you wanted." Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. She wasn't wrong. He had wanted out. He had been so sure that Evelyn had nothing left to offer him, that their marriage had run its course. He had convinced himself that there was nothing worth saving. But now, there was a child. "I need to find her," he muttered more to himself than to Sienna. Sienna scoffed. "Oh, of course you do. Because now that she's parading around with your son, suddenly you care? That's pathetic, Daniel." His jaw tightened. "This isn't about you, Sienna." Her eyes darkened at that, her lips curling into something venomous. "Oh, I think it is. Because if you go chasing after her, if you start digging into her life, you're going to prove to everyone, including yourself, that you still care. And I won't be humiliated like that." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence between them spoke volumes. Sienna sighed, shaking her head. "You know what? Do whatever you want. But don't expect me to stand by and watch while you unravel your life over a woman you threw away." With that, she stormed off, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He sat there for a long time, the city lights casting cold reflections across the glass walls of his penthouse. He had everything: a thriving business, a lifestyle others envied, a woman who was supposed to be everything he had ever wanted. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt like he had nothing at all. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. Finding Evelyn wouldn't be difficult. He had the resources, the connections. She might have disappeared from high society, but no one truly vanished, not in his world. But as he sat there, staring at her name, he hesitated. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't just about a child. This was about Evelyn. And the terrifying realization that, after all this time, she had become the one thing he couldn't control. Daniel Kensington had never been a man haunted by the past. He had always looked forward, always planned the next move, the next investment, the next conquest. But now, as he sat in his private office overlooking the New York skyline, he found himself unable to focus. His mind was trapped in the moment Evelyn walked into that ballroom, the moment he saw that child, Oliver. He had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, of keeping his emotions separate from his ambitions. But that moment had shaken something loose inside him, something he wasn't sure he could ignore. He had replayed it over and over, dissecting every detail: her poised stance, the quiet confidence in her expression, the way she had looked at him as if he were nothing more than a stranger. And then there was Oliver, a boy with his eyes, his jawline, the unmistakable Kensington features that had been passed down through generations. Daniel had no doubt that the child was his. The question that tormented him was, why hadn't he known? Why had Evelyn kept him a secret? For the past 24 hours, he had been relentless in his search. His team of private investigators, The same people who had uncovered hidden deals and buried scandals for him before had been tasked with a new mission: find Evelyn Kensington. He had expected it to be easy. After all, he had spent years in control of every situation, every person who had ever crossed his path. But Evelyn had disappeared so thoroughly that even his best men were coming up empty-handed. She's not in any of the expected places, his head investigator, Carter Langley, had reported earlier that morning. No addresses in her name, no recent financial activity that we can trace back to her. It's almost like she knew someone would come looking and covered her tracks in advance. That had frustrated Daniel more than he was willing to admit. Evelyn had always been intelligent, but this level of secrecy wasn't just coincidence. She had planned this. She had deliberately ensured that, if he ever wanted to find her, it wouldn't be easy. But he wasn't a man who backed down from a challenge. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the polished wood of his desk. He needed a different approach. Evelyn had made it clear she didn't want to be found, but that didn't mean she was untouchable. Everyone had a weakness, a pressure point that could be exploited. He just had to find hers. His gaze drifted to the gala's guest list, a file still open on his computer screen. She had reappeared for a reason. He refused to believe it was simply by chance. Evelyn had never been impulsive. Every move she made was calculated. She had wanted to be seen, had wanted him to know about Oliver, but on her terms. That meant she wasn't hiding completely. She had resurfaced in a way that ensured he would come looking for her. The realization both infuriated and intrigued him. Daniel closed the file and stood, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. If Evelyn wouldn't come to him, he would go to her world. He wasn't the kind of man who waited for answers. He took them. That night, he arrived unannounced at the last place he ever thought he'd find himself. A quiet, unassuming neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, far removed from the luxury he was accustomed to. The address had taken hours to uncover, a small but significant lead that Langley had managed to dig up, an art gallery, one that had hosted Evelyn's name in its event records more than once in the past year. The gallery was modest, nothing extravagant, the kind of place where artists displayed work that spoke more to emotion than price tags. It was a stark contrast to the world they had once shared, where appearances and power dictated value. He had always believed Evelyn thrived in that world, but standing there, he realized he had never truly known what she wanted. He stepped inside, the quiet murmur of conversation and the soft hum of classical music filling the space. People moved about, admiring paintings, sipping on glasses of wine. And then he saw her. Evelyn stood near the back, engaged in quiet conversation with a man he didn't recognize, a man who leaned in just a little too close, whose smile lingered just a second too long. The sight of it sent an unfamiliar irritation through Daniel's chest. He had no right to feel possessive, no reason to care. And yet, he did. She sensed him before she saw him. He knew at the moment. She stiffened slightly, the way her fingers hesitated on the stem of her wine glass. Then she turned, her gaze locking onto his, and for the second time in days, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. "Evelyn," he said, his voice calm, controlled, despite the storm inside him. She arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. "Daniel," she replied, unbothered, as if his presence was nothing more than an afterthought. "You're far from your usual circles. What brings you here?" He ignored the attempt at casualness. "You know why I'm here." She took a slow sip of her wine, her expression giving nothing away. "I have no idea what you mean." Daniel's patience, already thin, wore even thinner. "Oliver," he said simply, watching her reaction closely. "Why didn't you tell me?" Something flickered in her gaze, something guarded, unreadable. But then, she smiled, and it was that smile that unnerved him more than anything else. "And what would you have done if I had, Daniel? Would you have suddenly decided to be a father?" His jaw tightened. "I had a right to know." Her laughter was soft, but it wasn't warm. It was sharp, edged with something he couldn't quite place. "A right?" she echoed, shaking her head slightly. "You gave up that right the moment you chose to leave. The moment you looked at me and saw nothing worth keeping. Tell me, Daniel, if you had known about Oliver then, would you have stayed? Or would you have left anyway, just with a little more guilt?" The words hit harder than he wanted them to. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You always saw life as a transaction. Something to be won, something to be controlled. But Oliver isn't a business deal, and neither am I. I didn't tell you because I didn't owe you anything, not after the way you walked away. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. I may not have been a good husband, but I won't be absent from his life. Her eyes darkened slightly, her amusement fading. That's not your decision to make. Before he could respond, a small voice interrupted. Mom. Daniel's attention snapped to the source, to the small boy standing at Evelyn's side, looking up at them with quiet curiosity. Oliver. Seeing him up close was even more jarring than before. The resemblance was undeniable. Evelyn's expression softened instantly. It's okay, sweetheart, she murmured, kneeling beside him. We were just talking. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off the boy. He had spent years believing his past was behind him, that Evelyn had become nothing more than a chapter he had closed. But now, standing there, looking into the face of a son he never knew existed, he realized something chilling. Evelyn had moved on. Oliver had never needed him. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Kensington had no idea how to win. Daniel Kensington had always believed that power meant control. He had built his fortune, his reputation, his entire existence on the idea that nothing happened without his approval. But now, standing in that art gallery, staring at the child who bore his name without knowing it, he realized how little control he truly had. Evelyn had shattered his illusions in a single evening, unraveling years of carefully crafted certainty with just one revelation. He had a son, a living, breathing piece of himself, and yet he was a stranger to him. The weight of that truth settled deep in his chest, an unfamiliar and uncomfortable pressure that refused to dissipate. The gallery around him had fallen into a dull hum of background noise. Conversations continued, glasses clinked, but none of it mattered. The world had narrowed down to three people: Evelyn, Oliver, and himself. The boy, seemingly unaware of the gravity of the situation, looked up at his mother expectantly, his small fingers gripping the edge of her dress. He had the same sharp eyes as Daniel, the same intense gaze that had once made investors squirm under the weight of his scrutiny. Seeing it reflected back at him from a face so young, so innocent, was disorienting. Evelyn stood, smoothing a hand over Oliver's hair before turning back to Daniel with that same composed expression, that quiet defiance that told him she was ready for whatever move he made next. She had always been good at anticipating him, at staying one step ahead. It was infuriating, exhilarating, and now, deeply unsettling. We should go, she said, her voice level, as if they had been discussing nothing more than the weather. Daniel took a step forward before he could stop himself. Evelyn, wait. She met his gaze, and something in her expression flickered, something close to warning. Not here, she said softly, glancing briefly at Oliver. Not now. She was right. He had spent years navigating the delicate ecosystem of high society, and he knew the game well. This wasn't the place for a confrontation, not when the room was filled with watchful eyes and eager whispers. If he pushed too hard, he would only give the gossip mill more fuel. But that didn't mean he was going to let her walk away without answers. Where? His voice was quieter now, measured. He was willing to play by her rules, for now. Evelyn hesitated, and for the first time that evening, he saw a crack in her armor. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She wasn't unaffected by this, no matter how much she wanted to appear otherwise. Finally, she exhaled and pulled a card from her small clutch, pressing it into his palm. Tomorrow morning, she said, glancing down at Oliver, who was beginning to fidget. 10 o'clock. If you really want to talk, meet me there. Daniel's fingers curled around the card as she turned and walked away, Oliver following at her side. He stood there for a long moment, watching as she disappeared into the crowd, feeling a sensation he couldn't quite name. Something deeper than frustration, heavier than anger. Something dangerously close to regret. He glanced down at the card in his hand. An address. Nothing else. No name, no explanation. Just a single location and a time. Evelyn was making him come to her. And for the first time in years, Daniel realized that he wasn't the one in control of this game. The drive back to his penthouse was silent. Sienna, seething in the passenger seat, had finally given up on her tirade after realizing he wasn't listening. The moment they stepped inside, however, her patience ran out. You're not actually thinking of meeting her, are you? She demanded, tossing her clutch onto the glass coffee table with a sharp clatter. Daniel poured himself a drink before responding. I don't think I asked for your opinion. Sienna let out a sharp laugh, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Of course you didn't. Because Daniel Kensington doesn't take advice, right? He just acts. He just destroys things and pretends he doesn't care about the consequences. Daniel's jaw tightened. Careful, Sienna. No, you be careful, she snapped, turning to face him. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? How bad it will look if you start chasing after your ex-wife and some mystery child in front of the entire city. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, letting the burn settle before answering. He's not some mystery child. Sienna's expression hardened. So you admit it. He exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down with deliberate precision. We both saw him, Sienna. It's not exactly up for debate. She scoffed, arms crossed over her chest. And what? You're just going to walk into her life after all these years and demand to play daddy? Do you really think she's going to let you do that? Evelyn isn't stupid, Daniel. She doesn't need you, and she sure as hell doesn't need you messing up whatever life she's built for that kid. Her words hit harder than he wanted them to. He had always believed that power meant access, that he could walk into any situation and bend it to his will. But this wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a hostile takeover. Evelyn had shut him out of her life completely, and now he was realizing that he might not have a way back in. Sienna must have seen the flicker of doubt in his expression, because she softened slightly, stepping closer. Listen, she said, her voice lower now, almost coaxing. You don't owe her anything. You don't owe that kid anything. You walked away from that marriage for a reason. Don't go digging up ghosts, Daniel. You won't like what you find. He looked at her then, really looked at her. The woman he had chosen, the woman who had once seemed so exciting, so different from Evelyn. She was beautiful, undeniably so, but in that moment, he realized something unsettling. He didn't feel anything. No fire, no attachment, not even the thrill of conquest. Just emptiness. Sienna must have sensed it, because her lips pressed into a thin line. You're going to go, aren't you? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The next morning, he arrived at the address 10 minutes early. It wasn't what he had expected. No expensive high-rise, no exclusive gated community. Instead, it was a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city, lined with old brownstones and small cafes. It was the kind of place people built lives, the kind of place that felt untouched by the relentless hunger of men like him. He stepped out of his car, adjusting his cufflinks, and glanced around. Then he saw her. Evelyn was standing outside a small cafe, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She didn't look surprised that he had shown up. If anything, she looked like she had expected it. He took a slow breath and walked toward her. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched him, waiting. For the first time in years, Daniel Kensington was the one who had something to prove. Daniel Kensington had spent his life negotiating deals, acquiring companies, and maneuvering people like chess pieces, always confident in his ability to come out on top. But as he stood in front of Evelyn outside that quiet cafe, watching her study him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, he felt none of that certainty. The woman he had once walked away from had transformed into someone he didn't recognize. There was no trace of the woman who had once looked at him with admiration, no sign of the soft devotion she had carried in her eyes when they were married. Instead, there was distance, calculation, an impenetrable wall he had no idea how to get past. She turned toward the entrance without a word, pushing the cafe door open and stepping inside. The unspoken invitation was clear. If he wanted answers, he would have to follow. Daniel exhaled and did just that. The cafe was nothing like the places they used to frequent. No gold-trimmed menus, no walls lined with limited edition wine bottles, no private booths meant to keep conversations away from prying eyes. This was simple, intimate, the kind of place where regulars came for familiarity rather than prestige. Evelyn walked ahead, choosing a table in the back, away from the windows. He followed, sitting across from her as a waitress approached with an easy smile. The usual Evelyn? She nodded. Yes, please. The waitress turned to Daniel expectantly, and for a moment, he hesitated. He wasn't used to ordering for himself in places like this. Usually, his assistant or the waitstaff at his usual haunts anticipated his preferences without him having to ask. Just coffee, he said finally. Evelyn waited until the waitress was gone before she leaned back in her seat, folding her arms across her chest. All right, Daniel. You're here. Say what you need to say." He studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her mood. She wasn't hostile, but she wasn't open either. She was waiting, and he had the distinct feeling that this was a test. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, getting straight to the point. Evelyn arched a brow. "Tell you what." "You know what," he said, his voice sharper than intended. "About Oliver. About the fact that I have a son." She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly. "You say that like it would have made a difference." Daniel frowned. "It would have." Evelyn let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Would it?" "Because I remember the man who couldn't wait to be rid of me. The man who looked at our marriage like it was an inconvenience, something holding him back. Tell me, Daniel, if I had come to you, told you I was pregnant, what would you have done? Would you have suddenly changed your mind? Would you have stayed out of love, or would you have stayed out of obligation?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Because he didn't know. He had spent so long convincing himself that leaving Evelyn had been the right choice, that he had outgrown the life they had built together. But if he had known about Oliver, would that have changed anything? Evelyn must have seen the hesitation in his expression because she nodded, as if confirming something for herself. "That's what I thought." Daniel clenched his jaw, leaning forward. "You don't get to make that decision for me." "Didn't I?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because you already had. You just didn't know it yet." The waitress returned, placing their drinks on the table before retreating just as quickly, sensing the tension between them. Evelyn picked up her tea, blowing gently on the surface before taking a small sip. "I didn't tell you because I knew what would happen," she continued. "You would have felt obligated, and I didn't want that. I didn't want to raise a child in a marriage built on resentment, on the knowledge that his father only stayed because he felt trapped. So I left. I made a life for myself, for Oliver, and I don't regret it." Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the handle of his coffee cup. "I had a right to know, Evelyn." "Maybe," she allowed, setting her tea down. "But I had the right to protect my son from growing up as a Kensington pawn." The words hit him like a slap. "That's what you think I would have done?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it now. "Turn him into a business asset." Evelyn didn't blink. "Tell me I'm wrong." Daniel couldn't. Because deep down, he knew the kind of man he had been when they were married. He had been consumed by his ambition, by his hunger to build something bigger, something untouchable. He had viewed every aspect of his life through the lens of strategy, his business, his relationships, even his marriage. Would he have seen Oliver as anything different? The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of things unsaid. Finally, Evelyn sighed and glanced toward the window. "I didn't come to that gala for you, Daniel. I wasn't trying to make some grand revelation or ruin your life. Oliver doesn't even know who you are. To him, you're just another face in the crowd." Something about that admission stung more than it should have. Daniel ran a hand over his face. "Evelyn, look," she interrupted, her tone softer now, less sharp but no less firm. "I understand why you're upset. I get it. But my priority has always been Oliver, and I won't apologize for doing what I thought was best for him." Daniel let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. He didn't like it, didn't agree with it, but arguing with her wasn't going to change the past. And that wasn't why he was here. "I want to meet him," he said finally. Evelyn's gaze snapped back to his, and for the first time, he saw something close to hesitation. Not anger, not defiance, just hesitation. "That's not your decision to make," she said quietly. "I'm his father. And I'm his mother," she countered. "The one who's been there since day one. The one who's raised him, cared for him, loved him. You don't get to show up now and demand a place in his life just because you suddenly want it." Daniel exhaled, rubbing his thumb against the rim of his coffee cup. "I'm not asking for a demand. I need to know him, Evelyn. I need him to know me." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she sighed, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I don't have an answer for you right now," she admitted. "I need time." Daniel nodded, though he hated the uncertainty of it. He wasn't used to waiting. But this wasn't a deal to negotiate, wasn't something he could strong-arm his way into. Evelyn held all the cards, and for once in his life, Daniel Kensington had to play by someone else's rules. As he watched her finish her tea, the quiet strength in her posture, the resilience in her eyes, he realized something unsettling. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about something he had lost, something he wasn't sure he could ever get back. Daniel Kensington had never been a man who accepted waiting as an answer. Patience had never served him well in business, and it certainly wouldn't serve him now. He had spent his entire career making things happen, controlling outcomes, ensuring that no opportunity was left to chance. But this was different. This wasn't a hostile takeover or a carefully calculated negotiation. This was his son, and Evelyn, whether she realized it or not, had turned him into an outsider in his own story. The conversation at the cafe had left him restless. He replayed every word, every look Evelyn had given him, searching for cracks in her resolve. She had been firm, steady, unwilling to bend to his demands, but she had hesitated. That meant something. That meant there was still a way in. And Daniel wasn't about to waste time waiting for permission. By the time he arrived at his penthouse that evening, Sienna was already waiting for him, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. She had been silent all day, barely responding to his messages, and now, as she stood in the middle of the sleek living room, it was clear she had reached the end of her patience. "You met with her," she said, her voice flat. Daniel loosened his tie, walking past her toward the bar. "Yes." Sienna let out a sharp breath, crossing her arms. "Of course you did. And what? You think she's just going to let you waltz back into her life?" Into his life. Daniel poured himself a drink, watching the amber liquid swirl in the glass. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." Sienna laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Unbelievable. Do you even hear yourself? This isn't just some ex-fling, Daniel. This is a woman you left, a child you abandoned without even knowing he existed. And now you think you can just insert yourself back into their world." Daniel turned, meeting her gaze. "What do you want me to say, Sienna? That I should pretend he doesn't exist? That I should walk away again?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I want you to think, really think, about what this will cost you." He studied her for a long moment, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that this conversation wasn't just about Evelyn and Oliver. This was about them, about the life he had chosen with her, the life that was now unraveling. Sienna sighed, shaking her head. "You already made your choice once, Daniel. You left her. You built a life without her. And now that she's moved on, now that she's thriving without you, you suddenly want back in." He clenched his jaw. "It's not about her, isn't it?" Her voice softened slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. "You keep telling yourself this is about Oliver, but let's be honest. If Evelyn had walked into that gala alone, if there had been no child, would you have even thought about her again?" Daniel remained silent, because he didn't know the answer. Sienna let out a bitter laugh. "That's what I thought." She grabbed her purse from the couch and walked toward the door. "When you figure out what you really want, let me know. But don't expect me to sit here and wait while you chase ghosts." The door shut behind her, and Daniel was left alone in the empty penthouse, the silence pressing against him in a way it never had before. By morning, he had made his decision. Evelyn had told him she needed time. But time was a luxury he had never believed in. He had spent years building an empire, ensuring that every detail of his life was under his control. If she thought he would sit back and wait for her to decide whether he could be part of his son's life, she was wrong. So he did what he did best. He took action. The first step was finding out everything he could about Oliver's life. Where he went to school, what he liked, who he was when he wasn't just a name on a birth certificate Daniel had never seen. It didn't take long. His investigators were the best, and within hours, he had more information than Evelyn would have been comfortable with. Oliver Kensington, no Oliver Reed. Evelyn hadn't given him his last name. That realization stung more than he expected. He wasn't just an absent father. He had been erased completely. The boy was enrolled in a small, private school, not the kind of elite institution Daniel would have chosen, but respectable. He played soccer, excelled in reading, had a preference for chocolate chip pancakes on Sunday mornings at a small diner Evelyn frequented. Daniel read every detail, memorized every fact, trying to piece together the life that had been kept from him. But facts weren't enough. He needed to see him, to understand him beyond the cold, analytical reports in front of him. And so, for the first time in his life, Daniel found himself parked outside a modest schoolyard, watching as children rushed through the gates at dismissal. Then he saw him. Oliver was laughing, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, his dark hair tousled from the wind. He looked free, unburdened, nothing like the child of a man whose entire existence revolved around power and control. And yet, there it was again, that sharp intensity in his eyes, the same stubborn tilt of his jaw that Daniel recognized as his own. He was beautiful, and he had no idea who Daniel was. Daniel wasn't sure how long he stood there, watching, something foreign twisting in his chest. He had faced down billion-dollar deals, sat across from world leaders, commanded the attention of rooms filled with the most powerful men in the country. And yet, right now, looking at his own son, he felt something dangerously close to fear. Then Oliver turned. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Daniel's breath caught. It was only a second, just the briefest flicker of connection before Oliver was distracted by something else, by a friend calling his name, by the pull of childhood that had nothing to do with the man standing across the street. But for Daniel, that second changed everything. He needed to know him, not through reports, not through stolen glimpses from a distance. For the first time in his life, Daniel Kensington realized that winning wasn't the goal. This time, he had to earn his place. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know how. Oliver Reed had always known his mother was different from other parents. She wasn't the kind to hover, nor was she the type to treat him like a fragile thing that needed constant supervision. She was steady, reliable, someone who never made promises she couldn't keep. When she said she would be there, she was. When she told him something was for his own good, she meant it. There were no empty words, no false reassurances. But there was something else about her, too. Something unspoken, something Oliver had never been able to fully grasp. A sadness, maybe, or a weight she carried that he wasn't meant to see. He noticed it in the quiet moments, in the way her gaze sometimes drifted off when she thought he wasn't looking, in the way she held him just a little tighter when she tucked him in at night. It wasn't the kind of sadness that made her weak, though. No, his mother was anything but weak. And then, one night, everything changed. He had seen it in her face when she came home from the gala. The way she moved around their small apartment with an energy that was too controlled, too measured. Something had happened. He had asked her about it, of course. He always asked when something felt off, but she had just smiled and told him everything was fine. Except it wasn't. Because the next day, she had sat him down and told him that there was someone who wanted to meet him. Someone important. Oliver had never thought much about his father. He had asked, once or twice, when he was younger, but his mother had always told him the same thing. Some families looked different, and that was okay. They had each other, and that was enough. And he had believed her. She was all he had ever known, the only constant in his world. He didn't need a father, didn't feel the absence of one the way other kids at school did. So when she had told him there was a man named Daniel Kensington who wanted to see him, Oliver hadn't known what to feel. At first, he had been curious. The name didn't mean anything to him, but the way his mother had said it, the way her voice had tightened just a little, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just some man. This was someone who had mattered once, someone who had left an imprint on her life in a way no one else had. And now, he was supposed to meet him. Oliver had agreed, but not because he felt a desperate need to know his father. He had agreed because he wanted to understand. He wanted to see for himself who this man was, what made him so important that his mother, who never showed fear, had looked almost hesitant when she told him. So when he arrived at the quiet cafe where the meeting was supposed to take place, he was ready. Or at least, he thought he was. He saw him the moment he walked in. Daniel Kensington was nothing like Oliver had expected. The man sitting at the table was polished, refined, the kind of person who looked as though he belonged in magazines rather than in the real world. His suit was perfect, his hair neatly styled, but there was something else, something that didn't quite fit. His expression wasn't the one Oliver had expected from a man who had chosen to stay away all these years. He wasn't distant, wasn't indifferent. He looked uncertain, almost like he didn't know how to begin. Oliver slid into the seat across from him, feeling the weight of his mother's presence nearby. She wasn't hovering, wasn't interfering, but she was there, always there. And for the first time in his life, Oliver found himself studying another person the way he had studied her. Daniel Kensington, the man who had given him half of his DNA, was looking at him like he wasn't sure what to say, like he wanted to reach across the table and pull something back that had already been lost. So, Oliver said, breaking the silence first, "You're my father." Daniel blinked, as if startled by the directness. "Yes." Oliver nodded, considering that for a moment. "Where have you been?" He saw the way Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. "I didn't know about you," he admitted after a pause. I only found out recently. Oliver tilted his head slightly. And if you had known? Daniel exhaled, his jaw tightening for a brief second before he relaxed it. I don't know, he said honestly. I'd like to think I would have done things differently. Oliver appreciated that he didn't lie. He didn't know what he had expected from this meeting. He had thought, maybe, that Daniel would be the kind of person who tried too hard, who acted like a father when he hadn't earned the right to be one. Or maybe, he would be cold, distant, treating Oliver like an obligation rather than something real. But he wasn't either of those things. He was just a man who seemed as lost in this moment as Oliver was. You don't have to do this, Oliver said finally. Daniel frowned. Do what? Pretend, Oliver shrugged. Act like this is going to be some big reunion or whatever. I'm fine. I've always been fine. Daniel's expression changed at that, something flashing through his eyes too quickly for Oliver to name. I don't want to pretend, he said quietly. I just want to know you. Oliver studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. Daniel looked surprised. Okay. Yeah, Oliver said. But just so we're clear, I don't need a father. I have my mom. But if you want to know me, really know me, then I guess we can start there. Something in Daniel's posture shifted, like the weight of expectation had been lifted just a little. He nodded. I'd like that. And just like that, the impossible had begun. It wasn't easy. The weeks that followed were filled with careful, tentative steps. Daniel was cautious, never pushing too hard, never trying to force something that wasn't there. Evelyn remained protective but didn't stand in the way. And Oliver? He remained skeptical, but curious. Daniel wasn't what he had expected. He wasn't some distant, indifferent billionaire who only cared about money. He wasn't fake, wasn't forcing himself into Oliver's life the way some men might have. He was just there. He showed up. He listened. And slowly, Oliver started to see him not as the father he had never needed, but as something else. Something new. Something that, maybe, could be real. Daniel Kensington had always believed that the past was meant to be left behind. He had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, moving forward without hesitation, without regret. But now, as he sat across from Oliver in a quiet cafe on a rainy afternoon, he realized just how wrong he had been. It had been a few weeks since their first meeting, and in that time, Daniel had learned more about his son than he ever expected. Oliver was sharp, observant in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of himself. He didn't trust easily, but he also didn't hold back when he spoke. He was careful, deliberate, testing Daniel at every turn, as if waiting to see if he would break. And Daniel couldn't blame him. Why do you always wear suits? Oliver asked, stirring his hot chocolate lazily. Daniel blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. I suppose it's just a habit. Oliver hummed in thought, his small fingers tapping against the ceramic mug. You know you don't have to wear a suit all the time, right? Daniel smirked. Noted. Their conversations often went like this, lighthearted on the surface, but underneath, there was always something more. Oliver was still wary, still keeping a distance that Daniel wasn't sure he'd ever fully be able to close. But at least now he was there. That was something. The problem was, being in Oliver's life meant being in Evelyn's as well. And that was proving to be far more complicated. She had been civil, polite, but she hadn't softened. She kept the conversations short, to the point, as if she were constantly reminding him that his presence was conditional, that at any moment, she could revoke this small piece of access she had granted him. And he knew she was right, because the past wasn't finished with them yet. It started with a phone call. Daniel was in his office late that evening when his assistant knocked on the door. Sir, there's someone on the line for you. They say it's about Evelyn Reed. That got his attention. He picked up the call immediately, his grip tightening around the receiver. Who is this? A deep voice, unfamiliar, answered. Mr. Kensington, I have information you might find interesting. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his instincts kicking in. I don't take kindly to cryptic messages. If you have something to say, say it. The man chuckled. Let's just say your ex-wife hasn't been completely honest with you. There are things about her past, about the time she spent away from you, that you might want to look into. Daniel's blood ran cold. I'm listening. The man gave him an address, a location far removed from the circles Daniel and Evelyn had once lived in. It wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. Come see for yourself, the voice said before the line went dead. Daniel sat there for a long moment, the dial tone humming in his ear. He had never been one to chase ghosts, had never let himself be dragged into someone else's games. But this was different. This was Evelyn, and he had never been able to walk away from her. The next evening, he found himself in a quiet neighborhood outside the city, standing in front of a modest building with peeling paint and a sign that read Hope Haven Community Center. It was the kind of place that didn't belong in his world, too simple, too real. And yet, Evelyn had been here. He stepped inside, his presence immediately out of place among the worn-out couches and the soft hum of quiet conversations. A few people glanced up, their expressions curious but uninterested. Then he saw her. She was in the back of the room, sitting across from a woman who looked like she had lived 100 lives in half the time. Evelyn's expression was calm, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She was listening intently, nodding occasionally, completely unaware that Daniel was watching her. And for the first time, he realized something he had never fully considered. He had never known who Evelyn was outside of him. Their marriage had been built around his world, his ambitions, his carefully structured life. But now, looking at her, seeing the way she moved, the way she carried herself in a space that had nothing to do with him, he understood. There was an entire version of her he had never seen, and she had kept it from him on purpose. He stepped forward, his presence making the woman across from Evelyn pause. She looked up, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she sighed. I should have known you'd come. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Should you have? She didn't answer, only glanced at the woman she had been speaking to and gave her a small nod. The woman hesitated but eventually stood, leaving them alone at the table. Daniel took the empty seat. Are you going to tell me what this place is? He asked. Evelyn took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. It's a shelter, a support center for women and children. His brow furrowed. You work here? I do, she said simply. Daniel hadn't expected that. He knew she had left the life they had built together, had removed herself from the circles of wealth and status, but he had never considered what she had done instead. Now it was clear. She had built something new. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice quieter now. Evelyn looked at him then, really looked at him. Because it's none of your business. Something about the way she said it stung more than it should have. You've been hiding this from me, he said. I haven't been hiding, she corrected. I've just been living my life. You never asked. And that was the truth, wasn't it? He had never asked. Because for years, he had convinced himself that she didn't matter anymore. That leaving her had been the right choice. That she had simply become a part of his past, a chapter closed. But the past wasn't done with him yet. And neither was Evelyn. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. You don't get to come here, into my world, and act like you deserve answers, Daniel. You don't get to dig into my life just because you suddenly care. He met her gaze, unflinching. I care because I have a son. Her eyes softened just slightly, but her guard remained up. I know, she said, but that doesn't mean you get me, too. Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding once. He had come here expecting a confrontation, expecting to find secrets he could use to gain the upper hand. Instead, he had found something far more dangerous. A version of Evelyn who didn't need him. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was ready to accept that. Daniel Kensington had never been the kind of man who second-guessed himself. He had built his empire by trusting his instincts, making decisions with precision and confidence. But as he walked away from Hope Haven, away from Evelyn and the world she had created for herself, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind in a way he wasn't accustomed to. She had carved out a life completely separate from him, and not just for Oliver, she had done it for herself. That realization left an unsettling taste in his mouth, one he couldn't quite shake. He had been prepared for resistance, had expected her to be wary of his sudden interest in their son. But what he hadn't expected was how much it would bother him to know that she had moved on, not just emotionally, but entirely. She had built something of her own, something real, something that had nothing to do with the wealth and status that once defined their world. And worst of all, she had done it without him. By the time he arrived at his penthouse, the tension in his shoulders had only grown. He pushed through the door, shrugging off his coat, his mind still tangled in the conversation he'd had with Evelyn. He needed space, time to think, but as soon as he stepped inside, he knew he wasn't going to get either. Sienna was waiting for him. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, a glass of wine in one hand, her phone in the other. She looked up as he entered, her lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, look who finally decided to come home," she said, her tone sharp despite the casual way she leaned back. Daniel sighed, already exhausted. "Not now, Sienna." She let out a soft, humorless laugh, setting her wine down on the glass coffee table with a little too much force. "Not now? That's all you ever say lately. Not now, not tonight, not this conversation." She stood, crossing the room toward him. "You've been distant, absent. Do you really think I haven't noticed?" Daniel ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling slowly. "I have a lot on my mind." "Yeah," she scoffed. "I'm sure you do. Let me guess. You've been playing house with your ex-wife and your long-lost son." His jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. "This isn't about you, Sienna." "That's exactly the problem," she snapped, stepping closer, her expression hardening. "For years, it's always been about me. About us. And now, suddenly, I don't even exist in your world anymore. You're off chasing after the family you threw away, acting like you're some kind of changed man, like you're not the same selfish bastard who walked away from them in the first place." Daniel met her gaze, his patience wearing thin. "You don't know anything about this." Sienna let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, but I do. I know exactly how this story goes. You left her because she wasn't enough for you, because you wanted more. And now, suddenly, she's the one thing you can't stop thinking about. Isn't that right?" Daniel said nothing, which was answer enough. Sienna's expression darkened. "God, you're pathetic," she hissed. "Do you even know what you want, Daniel? Because it sure as hell doesn't seem like it." He sighed, shaking his head. "I didn't come home to fight with you." "Then what did you come home for?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Because I'm starting to think this isn't your home anymore." That sentence hung between them, thick with implication. Daniel had never been one to shy away from confrontation, but this wasn't just an argument. This was an ending. Sienna stared at him, waiting for him to deny it, to say something that would prove her wrong. But he didn't. He couldn't, because deep down, he knew she was right. Her laughter was hollow. "Wow, you're really going to do this? You're really going to throw this away?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "I think we both know this has been over for a while." Sienna shook her head, backing away from him as if she couldn't stand to be near him anymore. "You are such a coward," she spat. "You think you can just go back to her? That she's going to take you back? That your son is suddenly going to love you?" Newsflash, Daniel, people don't forget. You walked away from them once. You don't just get to walk back in and pretend it never happened. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not pretending anything." She scoffed. "You think you're different now? That just because you suddenly want to be in their lives, it erases everything you did?" He didn't respond. Because no, he didn't believe that. He wasn't stupid enough to think that showing up now would make up for years of absence. But he did know that doing nothing, walking away again, would be worse. Sienna studied him for a long moment, then exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You know what? Fine. Go play your little redemption story. But don't come crawling back when it all falls apart." With that, she turned and stormed toward the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. Daniel stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, feeling a strange sense of relief settle over him. It was done. Sienna had been right about one thing. He didn't know if Evelyn would ever forgive him, if Oliver would ever see him as anything more than a stranger. But for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he wanted. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. The next morning, Daniel woke to an empty penthouse. Sienna was gone, and with her, the last remnants of the life he had built after leaving Evelyn. It should have felt like a loss, but it didn't. It felt like something else, something closer to freedom. He dressed quickly, his mind already set on the next step. Evelyn had spent years making sure he had no place in her life, but now, he had an opening. Oliver had given him that, whether the boy realized it or not. And Daniel wasn't about to waste it. He arrived at Oliver's school just as classes were letting out, standing at a distance, watching as the children spilled out of the building. He spotted Oliver almost immediately. His son was easy to recognize, not just because of his resemblance to Daniel, but because he carried himself with the same quiet confidence. He wasn't loud like the other kids, but he wasn't withdrawn either. He existed in his own space, comfortable and secure. Evelyn was there, too, waiting for him just like she always did. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the crowd with the careful awareness of a mother who always knew exactly where her child was. For a moment, Daniel just watched them. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he stepped forward. Evelyn saw him immediately. Her expression didn't change, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides. He expected her to turn away, to pull Oliver closer and make it clear that his presence wasn't welcome. But she didn't. She just watched as he approached, waiting, testing him. Daniel stopped a few feet away, meeting her gaze. "I want to do this right," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever that looks like. Whatever it takes." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then looked at Oliver, who was still blissfully unaware of the conversation happening just a few steps away. Finally, she exhaled softly. "Then prove it." Daniel nodded, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to be worthy. Daniel Kensington had never been a man who begged. He had never needed to. His entire life had been built on the foundation of power, having it, keeping it, wielding it in a way that left no room for doubt. People either respected him or feared him, and in his world, that had always been enough. But as he stood in front of Evelyn, hearing the quiet challenge in her voice, he realized that this wasn't a situation he could force his way through. Prove it. 2 words. Simple, direct, and yet impossibly difficult. He had expected resistance. He had expected Evelyn to push back, to keep him at a distance. What he hadn't expected was for her to leave the door open, even just a crack. And now, for the first time in his life, Daniel understood the weight of what it meant to truly earn something. He had spent the past few weeks watching Oliver from a careful distance, trying to understand the child who was his son in name, but a stranger in reality. The boy was observant, quick-witted, with a confidence that was impossible to ignore. He was cautious, but not closed off, curious, but not desperate for approval. And the more Daniel learned about him, the more he saw the parts of himself reflected back in ways he wasn't sure how to process. This wasn't just about wanting to be in Oliver's life. It was about proving he was worthy of it. And so he started small. He didn't force meetings, didn't demand time, or try to impose himself where he wasn't wanted. Instead, he showed up. At first, it was just in the background, standing a few feet away when Evelyn picked Oliver up from school, nodding in silent acknowledgement when their eyes met. He didn't push, didn't try to make the boy interact with him. He let Oliver lead. The first time Oliver approached him willingly was 2 weeks later. Daniel had been waiting near the park where Evelyn usually took him after school. He had expected to watch from a distance, to let Oliver dictate the pace. But instead, the boy had wandered over on his own, standing in front of Daniel with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. "You're still here," Oliver said, his tone neutral, but there was a hint of something beneath it. Curiosity, maybe. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I am." Oliver studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Mom says you used to work all the time." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "I did. Do you still?" The question caught him off guard. He had been running his empire for so long that he hadn't considered what his life had looked like from the outside. "I guess I still do," he admitted. "But maybe not as much as before." Oliver nodded as if that answer made sense, then kicked at the ground with the toe of his shoe. "So, what do you do when you're not working?" Daniel hesitated. No one had ever asked him that before. His entire identity had been built around his career, around success, around making more, achieving more. He had never been the kind of man who stopped to think about anything beyond that. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "What do you do when you're not at school?" Oliver grinned. "Lots of things. I like soccer and reading, and I build things sometimes." Daniel's brow lifted slightly. "Build things?" "Yeah," Oliver said, his enthusiasm growing. "Like, with Legos and stuff. I made this huge castle last week, but then it kind of fell apart when my friend tried to move it." Daniel smirked. "Sounds like a faulty foundation." Oliver laughed. "Yeah, that's what Mom said." Something about that moment, small, insignificant to anyone else, felt monumental to Daniel. Because for the first time, he wasn't just the outsider looking in. He was part of the conversation. It wasn't instant. Trust wasn't built overnight, and Daniel knew that. But as the days passed, the distance between them began to shrink. Oliver started talking to him more, asking questions, testing the waters in his own way. Evelyn remained watchful, her guard still in place, but she didn't interfere. She let them find their own rhythm, their own way forward. And then, one evening, everything shifted. Daniel had been walking Oliver home from the park, something that had become an unspoken routine between them. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with the deep oranges and purples of an early sunset. "Mom says you used to live in a really big house," Oliver said suddenly, looking up at him. "I did," Daniel said. "Still do, actually." Oliver frowned slightly. "But you don't like being there?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "It's just a place. It doesn't feel like much of anything anymore." Oliver nodded thoughtfully. "I like our place. It's not big, but it's nice. Cozy, I guess." Daniel smiled faintly. "Cozy sounds nice." Oliver was quiet for a moment, then looked up at him again. "Do you want to come inside?" Daniel stopped walking. He wasn't sure he had heard right. Oliver shrugged, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "I mean, just for a little bit. If you want." Daniel looked ahead, saw Evelyn standing by the door, watching them. She had heard. She had seen. And for the first time, there was something different in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but something close. He nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Kensington realized that the things worth having were the things you had to fight for. Not with power, not with money, but with patience. And he was ready to fight for this. For Oliver. For Evelyn. For the life he had never known he wanted.